Now let's look at the status quo in India. What is the current status quo in India with respect to opposition? We saw in 2019 that the majority party won by a vast majority of votes. Now the opposition party, to have a leader of opposition, was supposed to get at least 10% of the number of seats in the Lok Sabha, which was 55 seats. However, the opposition party got 52 seats, which was still 3 seats less than the required number. So the current standing of today is that there is no leader of opposition in the parliament today. What else? The opposition party does not even have a permanent leader. It is functioning on an interim chief, right? So what does this mean to India right now? Now, we must understand that this is not the first time that such a situation has happened. In fact, this is the third time. There were 2 other times when the party won by such a huge majority that there was no leader of opposition. And those 2 other times were the time when Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru was the Prime Minister of our country and when Rajiv Gandhi was the Prime Minister of our country, where they had won such a majority that there was no opposition leader. Now, so does this entire scenario mean that there is a complete absence of opposition in our country? I would argue that right now there is a very weak opposition in our country, right? They are not doing as much as they should to point out the government's flaws. But I would not argue that there is a complete absence of opposition in our country, because at the end of the day, opposition is a system of checks and balances, and this system of checks and balances can be done by 2 other sources as well. The first source is the judiciary. Now, the judiciary is also a system of checks and balances on the government, and they can do so by judicial review. Now, the question arises, what happens if the judiciary itself becomes corrupt, if the judiciary is no longer independent? Then, in that case, we moved to the second part, the second system of checks and balances in our country, and that is the people. Because at the end of the day, democracy is a country, democracy is the government of the people, for the people, by the people. So therefore, when the government is not doing its job, when the opposition is not doing its job, then the people must do their job. The people cannot shy away from their job. And the people can do so through protests, and these protests through a system of dissent, and this dissent is protected under Article 19 of freedom of speech and expression, however, with reasonable restrictions, within reasonable restrictions. And they can also do so through asking questions to the government. They can do so by their right to vote. And yet today, we see that dissent is brutally suppressed in our country. We see students getting hit, students, people just getting called traitors, people being called traitors for speaking against the government, when in fact, this is just how a democracy should be. A democracy should not be where voices are suppressed. Democracy should be where you can criticize the government and not be punished for it. On the other side of the spectrum, you also have dissenters who cross the line, who move beyond the reasonable restrictions, who do or say certain things against Article 19 clause 6, wherein they say some things to hurt the public morality, to hurt the safety and security of the nation. So you have these 2 spectrums, and both of these are detrimental to a democratic setup. So when somebody asks me the question, is there a lack of opposition in our country? I believe what the underlying question really is why is opposition so important? And the answer can be found in a single word: democracy. And it is the responsibility of the citizens of India to make sure that this democracy does not die, that the opposition does not die, that the right to have different opinions than someone else does not die, and is not shamed, and is not called being anti-national just because you have a different opinion than somebody else. In fact, we have the right to have different opinions from somebody else, and even if you don't agree to that particular opinion, you can at least respect it. And similarly, even the person who's voicing their opinion must do so in a very respectful manner, because you cannot ask for respect when you don't give respect. So In conclusion, is there an absence of opposition in our country? I would say in the parliament, the opposition is perhaps weak and the opposition is perhaps not doing their job. But I believe when it comes to the complete absence of opposition, I would say that as long as the constitution survives, as long as there is a provision for Article 19 in our constitution, opposition cannot die. Thank you.
Thank you, Jayashree. Judges, the floor is now open to questions.
Is it okay if I ask questions after the other candidate also finishes?
Definitely, sure. Varsha?
Then we can have Varsha speak now.
Sure, sir. Sure.
Yeah,
Varsha, please go next.
great. Am I audible? Great. Shall I start now? Okay, brilliant. So what we understand as opposition, I'd like to define. So parliamentary opposition is a form of opposition which is based on ideological differences. So ideally in a democracy, you have two factions. One faction is the majority ruling faction, which has gained the people's favor. The other faction, which is lesser known, but still plays a vital role in panning out democratic settings and panning out democracy in a nation, right? What happens with absence of democracy is not something that's very, very like evident. It's not as drastic as you think, but slowly over time, slowly over events, you get to see that it has very mind-numbing effects and it's very dangerous, right? So I'd like to go back in time in 1933, where the German Nazi Party won, right? And that's when Adolf Hitler came on top as the German Chancellor. It's not like the Weimar Republic lost, but their lack of participation in this democracy, their lack of involvement made Nazi Republic much, much more stronger, which made Hitler eradicate democracy and take up dictatorship altogether, right? I'd like to go back to the 1960s again in Romania when we talk about Nicolae Ceausescu. And he was a brutal man. He won through democracy, but he imposed dictatorship in a country like Romania and starved people through a communist regime. What this does is, lacking opposition is not necessarily a bad thing, but unless your ruling party is kept in check, unless we question the ruling party, unless we keep them on hold, you are not liable to answers, right? It's not like we don't have a judiciary, it's not that we don't have opposition. Several events in this country over the past year have shown that we have opposition, especially when students protested when it came to CAA, when it came to abrogation of Article 370. We have had opposition. But what opposition means is we have opposition from the people, we have opposition from the public. With the lack of legislature involved in this, the lack of people standing out in the legislature and questioning the majority government leads to be ultimately weakening, which ends up making the opposition lose its efficacy, right? The idea of opposition is to keep a check, is to keep a balance on the actions of the government. But our lack of opposition in the democracy is startling because it has deteriorated rapidly, right? So I'd like to give a throwback to 2009 elections between the NDA and the UPA. The UPA won about 206 votes and the NDA won about 116, right? 200, you seem to have a fair distance and a fair amount of divide between them. This elections, though, this election 2019 was very, very scary because the NDA won 353 seats and the UPA won hardly about 90. That's 4 times the amount of people who have won in the majority, right? With such a less minority, it's not a bad thing. But the lack of efficient people in the minority, lack of people standing up and questioning the majority leads to majority being an absolute authoritarian in what they do. Even as we look at events that pan out, even as in states that we see, even when there is a Congress, even when there is an opposition to what we consider to a majority, the majority is so overwhelming. There are so many people in the majority that you find it hard to counter them. Even worse, to have people come onto the side of the opposition and support against the majority, right? This is where I feel that Congress has really lost its hold because they've lost their appeal to people, right? Questioning ideologies is a very, very different thing, but defaming, shaming the democratic majority for who they are isn't the way you move a democracy. And that way the quality of the opposition in our country has rapidly deteriorated, right? And it's come to a place where the Congress is pitiful peacefully trying to get seats and is changing. But what they don't realize is the fact that the India that we have now is very different from the 1960s India, the 1970s India, or even the 1980s where they reigned supreme, right? This country is not as subservient as it was anymore. People are growing, people are learning, people are becoming better. And as people are becoming more participative in a democracy, they obviously want to side with people who have the right kind of values they'd like to share, who have the right kind of agendas they'd like to share. Congress's failure does not root in the fact that they lack popularity, but in the fact that they lack efficient core values, they lack efficient agendas they put forward, right? Ideas about debt waiving for farmers seems like a great idea unless you have countermeasures in place. How are you going to fiscally manage it in a financial problem? How are you going to account for it when you're making a budget? There are several questions which the opposition does not answer for its own agendas, where they fail to make a mark in the public. And in that sense, we do have an absence of democracy, sense of opposition in a democracy, sorry. But the opposition that we see in a legislation isn't the only form of absence of democracy we see in a place. When we look at places where you have people going out of their way, people fighting the majority, people fighting the laws put in place, I feel that opposition needn't be legislative, but we have opposition from all around the country. This is a democracy. You have a right to voice out your opinions. You have a right to say what you want to say. And you also have a right to oppose to what is fundamentally put down on you. I don't think opposition in this country truly ever dies as long as we have free will to express and live. But the absence of efficient democracy in a legislature is truly frightening, because there is no way a public can rage around it or go around it unless we have a strong opposition in place. With this, I'd like to conclude.
Thank you so much, Varsha. Judges, the floor is now open to questions to both Jayashree and Varsha. Jayashree, you're requested to kindly switch on your video.
Abhishek,
Gopika,
why
would
don't
you
you
like to go
start?
first?
No,
Okay,
you go
great,
first.
great, great, great.
Yeah.
Okay. So my first question to Jayashree. So I have two questions in total. One is just a fact check, and the first question would be: you spoke about oppositions having checks and balances through judiciary and the public, right? So then, what is the purpose of us having an representative democracy if it is ultimately going to come down to people to protest against, rather raise their voices against any legislation which is passed? The ultimate point of having a strong opposition inside the Lok Sabha or in the state legislative assemblies, as a matter of fact for states, is that any legislation which is infringing rights of the people or is not in the best interest of the countries do not make it to the paper or do not go make their way to the president's office for a signature. If it is already been passed as a law, fighting it through after that, after people are going through all the suffrage that comes through in light of that enactment, completely destroys the fundamental aspect of having a strong opposition, or rather the reason behind which a strong opposition was envisaged in the constitution. So what would you say about that? And second question regarding fact check, you referred to two instances in the past where there was no strong opposition, one during Jawaharlal Nehru's tenure, and other was during Rajiv Gandhi. If you can just refer to which term it was, because Jawaharlal Nehru has been prime minister for more than once.
So in answer to your first question, so the reason why I talked about, the chronology of my speech was first talk about how weak the opposition in the legislation is and how that is still the primary thing. And in case that fails, then you have the people and then you have the judiciary and all that. Now, the reason why I said it in that order is because at the end of the day, the people who are made the majority is done by the people themselves, because the people vote for the government. And the very fact that the majority is the majority is because the people voted for them, and the minority is the minority is because people didn't vote for them. So now what happened? Now, obviously, people would have voted for them in huge hopes of the government actually having good intentions. But in a situation where the government promises something on the face of it and then fails to fulfill its promises, So in that circumstances, since the voting is already done, since the minority is already in the minority in the legislative community, and where there is no even leader of opposition, and where they are already weak in nature, the only forum open is then the judiciary, and then the people. Of course, this is quite a sad thing to happen, and ideally this should not be happening. But in a situation where the people themselves have voted the government, and then the government turns its back on its people, then the only type of opposition that you can expect is from the people, because otherwise you'll have to wait for another 5 years for another voting to be done. So that is why I put it in that chronology. Okay, as to the first question, sir, second question, sir, I will definitely do a fact check. But as per my knowledge, I think it was the first term of Jawaharlal Nehru. Okay.
Thank you, Jayashree. Yeah.
Yeah, so Jayashree, my question to you is, you said that the opposition is weak in terms of numbers, in terms of the difference, or in terms of the margin by which they became the opposition. But my question to you is, why do you say that they have failed as an opposition in the other sense, not in terms of numbers, but in terms of opposing the policy or putting their stand forward? Why do you think they have failed? Because whenever I see any policy brought in by the NDA government, there is always a counter by all the other opposition parties as to why this is bad and why this is bad. Invariably, it is always to find fault with it. So what else do you feel an opposition party should do to be more effective?
Ma'am, thank you for the question. Ma'am, one of the most important things with respect to any party is public support. And what we must do is make sure that the public is on their side. Now, what's happening right now with opposition parties is that even though majority of the people, let's say, is against a particular legislation that has been passed by the government, and even the opposition has been criticizing that particular same law, at the same time, you see that the people are not necessarily, saying no because the opposition says no. They're saying no because of the government. In fact, I know many of my friends themselves who don't like to choose between the two parties. They just know that this particular law is wrong, and that is why they are opposing it. But they are not opposing it because the Congress says it's so. So what I feel is there's a lack of leadership in the opposition party. There's a lack of a true charismatic leader who can inspire the masses. So in this instance, I would like to quote the example of when during the 1975, when Indira Gandhi was in power, and then there was this huge opposition that was happening. The opposition, when let's say Jayaprakash Narayan had started this whole student movement. So you had a leader who could inspire the masses, to tell you that this is what the government is doing wrong. But from the opposition side, we see a lack of leadership. Sure, they may criticize the government, they may say this and that, but at the end of the day, it all means nothing if you don't have a point of reference, if you don't have a leader who can inspire the masses and who can ask them, next term you vote for us and we'll make things better. So they don't give us an alternative in that sense, and that is where they are majorly failing.
All right, so you think their failing is in not giving you or is in not inspiring you to vote for them in the next year, and not the fact that they don't bring out the failings of the ruling party? So is that their disadvantage, or is that their failing, that they are not able to inspire you to vote for them in the next election? Is that what makes them a bad opposition?
No, it's of course not. That is one of the reasons. That is one of the major failings. Of course, the very fact that they are not able to effectively criticize the government. But also, on the other hand, I would also like to bring about a point which I had seen, wherein the Congress party, in defense of their criticisms, they are being heavily criticized against. They had stated that right now media is heavily influenced by the majority party, and it's very difficult for us to bring a point forward when the entire media is biased towards a particular party. So the media here also plays a role. Even when they are criticizing the government, perhaps they cannot do as well as they should be doing because of certain other factors as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gopika, you want to go first to Varsha?
Yeah, okay. So actually, my question to Varsha is also the same thing as to how do you feel that the opposition can be more effective?
The opposition can be more effective by bringing more public participation in their opposition to policies, because that adds a real gravitas to the kind of arguments you put forth, right? It's one thing to oppose a policy, it's another to have public support over it. So if I support, let's say, NEP, right? And if I'm a legislator, and if I'm in a minority, and if I'm overpowered by a majority, my real stakehold lies in getting people's support. And by people's support, I'm talking about educators, administrators, people who are relevant to the field and who have opinions in it. That's how you leverage, right? You leverage when and where it's appropriate, and you leverage with people's support, right? I understand that the Congress is heavily overpowered by the majority this time, but that doesn't let them excuse or slack off by the fact that they can't make the best of what they have, right? You can still be an active participation in this democracy no matter how big the majority is, if you choose to take up on it. I genuinely feel that if the Congress or whatever the minority is consisted of, if they take real steps towards including public participation, bringing real concerns, getting petitions, putting it in front of judiciary, doing all the works and involving the entire people in the process, I believe you can beat the majority at that game. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
That was very well taken, Varsha. So I have a question which Jayashree can also answer, followed after Varsha. So Varsha, what's your take in light of your speech? What's your take on the role of opposition and no confidence motion initiated in the parliament?
I understand the reasons behind the opposition bringing forth the no confidence motion, because the government that was promised to us is not the government that is there right now, right? 2019 politics is very different from 2020 politics. We were promised so many different things, but right now we're in quarter 4 minus 23.9 points and officially in a recession mode, right? And I understand the opposition's point of view of bringing forth a no confidence motion. But here's the thing, the opposition needs more people power to what they're saying, because considering that a majority of people voted for the majority, I don't think they're swayed by the actions of the majority to go drastically against them. That's the first thing. Like Jayashree said, the media has been constantly being whitewashed by the majority. It's been put in a very glamorous light, in a very hopeful light. I understand the optimism. I really want to believe in it, but it's just that the facts and logics are stacked against me. And ultimately, it boils down to how powerful they are in legislative terms. Because if they are at such a minority, it's very, very hard to even bring it to the table first. Passing it is another big thing. And considering how powerful the majority is, right? We're talking about 353 people on power as compared to 90 in a majority. That's 4 times the number of minority you have. And do you really think it is really possible to bring a no confidence motion with that big a disparity? I think not. I understand the reason why they're doing it, but I don't think it's going to be feasible.
Thank you, Varsha. Jayashree, do you want to add on something to what Varsha said?
You should
You need to
unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Sorry. So my answer is basically the same. So if the majority party is enjoying majority, it'll be very difficult to pass a no confidence motion against them.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, speakers.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Both of
you
you
so
did
much.
really well.